Okay, looks like we are. I was gonna wait just a few seconds.
Okay,
All right, I'm gonna
looks
mute
like we
this. Fantastic. Wow, I am extremely excited and honored to welcome Martha Wells, a New York Times best-selling novelist in science fiction and fantasy. And you have so much experience and craft and storytelling and creating radical characters that are very diverse. I'm really excited, and I think you need no introduction because we're going to be posting the bio on the YouTube as well later and creating a post for that. But let's, without further ado, let's dive right in. Like, how did you discover your passion? Like, when was that moment that you knew, or I guess, what were sort of your origin story around writing and storytelling?
I'm really not sure because I always, people say as long as I can remember, but literally as long as I can remember, I wanted to be a writer. And I always loved stories and I love science fiction and fantasy. When I was a kid, it was back when there's only 5 channels on the TV and some of them didn't work right. And the one I watched a lot had Godzilla movies and monster movies and early science fiction series like Land of the Giants and Sequest and all that kind of stuff. And I always just really loved it. And I'm not really sure what led me to want to be a writer. Possibly, I do remember when I first realized that was a job I could actually do, or was actually real people did that job. My mother collected books by Irma Bombeck, who was a columnist, a humor columnist who wrote about like her family but it was all really funny. It was really entertaining. And she also wrote about being a woman, living in the suburbs and being a writer and nationally syndicated newspaper writer. So that kind of told me, writing was a real job that people could do, that women could do. And because before that, it's like one of my cousins said all books were ghostwritten.
Mm.
And it's like, Al, what that means all the writers are dead or something? Yeah. I was really, even when I was sort of confused about how the book started with the person wrote it and it ended up in the store, or the library, but I really didn't know what was going on.
Wow, that's really incredible. Like, how was your like neighborhood or sort of the aesthetic of like which did you mention the city where you grew up in?
I grew up in Fort Worth in fairly not really poor, but probably low middle class. A lot of old houses, and these were in Fort Worth. They have those. When I was growing up, these tiny, well, we think of them as tiny now, like 1,100 square feet, 1,200 square feet, little brick or wooden houses with huge lots because the kids would stay outside, for 12 or 14 hours a day. And then because the actual house, there just wasn't that much room inside it for your kids. And so a lot of playing outside. But I lived on a fairly busy street that actually connected to a highway. So I wasn't allowed to go out and go find other kids to play with. My cousins lived not just only a mile or so away and easily within walking distance, but I wasn't allowed to go up there, by myself. So everybody else was having this great, child running around and doing all this stuff. And I was kind of isolated. I had an older sister, but she was 9 years older than me. So it's pretty isolated environment. So kind of where I started really kind of living in my own imagination. Mm. And that's probably one of the reasons why I really got into the Irma Bombeck books, because she wrote about she had like, I think 4 or 5 kids. And so just the idea of having kids around to play with was really an aspirational fantasy at the time.
Wait, so the stories had kids in them that you resonated with, or you sort of saw yourself through them?
Yeah, sometimes the actual the more real stories, did. But the science fiction and fantasy, I got into that really early because in the Fort Worth Public Library that we went to, they had the children's section next to the science fiction and fantasy section. And I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to be in the adult science fiction and fantasy section. And they had, pulp covers with really, wild aliens and people in bikinis and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so it was really interesting. And also they didn't really care about what you checked out either back then. So I got into it really early and read a lot of books that were over my head. And a lot of them I really enjoyed, but some stuff this is long before YA was a genre. And so a lot of books that were over my head and I didn't really get until much later when I reread them finally.
No, that's amazing. And I feel like for me, it's like when I first moved to the US, I was like surrounded by books in the library. And I feel like as I grew older, it almost as if my relationship with stories or books sort of transformed. Like, what was that like as you grew older and becoming more socially and politically aware? Like, how was your relationship with stories and books and narratives and what you saw, what you didn't see?
Well, I think it's, especially as I've gotten older, it's really amazing when I read something like some British mysteries, which at the time when I read them, probably in college or a little after, seemed fine. And then later and they were good books, and I reread them and it was like, wow, this author is really reactionary. And it didn't dawn on me that the magazine or the newspaper they were talking about that was helping those terrible criminals and blah, blah, blah was The Guardian. It's like, I love The Guardian. What are you doing? And things like that, where it's just amazing what you don't notice. As a kid, the stuff goes over your head, you're not realizing, which in some way is good because then you don't get, I guess, inoculated or brainwashed with these attitudes if you hit it at the right time, where you're just like, it didn't dawn on you. But I do feel books can affect your thinking a lot. So I can kind of see why it's probably better not to stick with your own age level. But then again, if you're I was a really advanced reader for my age. So my age level was kind of boring at the time.
No, I think that's incredible. I like, was there a moment where you started to put your pen to paper, where you're like, okay, I want to start crafting narratives, or I feel like I could do this better? Like, was there, like, what was that process for you? Like, did you have a community, or did you kind of do it in your own room? Or like, what was sort of your inception of your will to become a writer?
I started trying to write stories really early. I have my mother had reams of just paper where I had, in pencil and crayon and whatever, I had written Godzilla stories, Godzilla fanfic, basically, and kind of things like that. I didn't really try to write a story until probably right before I went to college. And I still remember it pretty vividly. It was basically, I'd read a fancy short story that really impressed me, and I kind of tried to write something like that. So it's very derivative of this other writer's story, but it was, it was practice. When I started doing a lot of really, I couldn't really complete a story at that time, but I was doing a lot of things like writing conversations and writing descriptions. And I had kind of evolved my own little writing course for myself without really reference to anything else. Wow. When I got to college, I went to Texas A&M University, and Steve Gould was doing a writer's workshop for their free university, which was kind of the public education thing. And so that was my first writer's workshop, and I managed to write a story for that. And I just kept going. I tried a couple of times to submit to magazines while probably my third or fourth year in college, but no success.
Wow.
And it wasn't until after I'd graduated and been out a couple of years, I wrote a novel, which ended up being the one that sold. So
That's amazing. Like I have so many questions. Like, do you feel like you have a sense of responsibility as an artist or as a writer to tell like diverse and unique stories that change people? Or did you sort of come at it from, okay, I'm going to create narratives because I have a story to tell? Or is it more so like sort of what you mentioned a little bit? I look up to these authors and I feel like I'm inspired by their works and I want to create stories similar to them. Like, was there a sense of change or justice or even like a way of like engaging society for you, or is it something more you're aware about that now today?
I think it's a combination of all of those, though I am very much aware now the effect my writing has on people. And I think that makes me a lot more um, careful in trying to figure out I'm not, you know, being offensive and trying to kind of root out stereotypes in your own thinking. I think it's such a mental process because, you know, I grew up in the 70s and just having to deal with my own brainwashed sexism basically has been a process as it goes along. And that just took me years to deal with. It's like you have to work on yourself mentally and kind of try to um, free yourself from these bad attitudes and stuff that you grew up around. I think I was lucky in some respects because I was such a voracious reader. I was getting a lot of, I was probably more raised by books and the TV to a large extent. So that I think was a bonus for me. I saw a lot of people, listen to a lot of people talk. I think my teachers were at school were pretty progressive for the time. So I think I had a lot of help doing this, but I think I started out just kind of wanting to tell these stories that I liked. And as you grow as a writer, I think you have to be, think about all the different conversations you see with other writers and stuff and try to make your work more, I mean, it's making it more diverse. It's like, that's what reality is. You don't want to, it's not, it's having trouble getting my thoughts straight, but you're just trying to show reality. And looking at the past works where, everybody's white, everybody's a guy, it's just as dated as everybody smoking and, on the spaceship and that kind of thing, those stories. And it's, I just feel like I always want to look to the future and just most recently for me, the way the explorations in gender and what gender really means to individual people and how it's not a binary, it's a spectrum, like sexuality is a spectrum, and just trying to explore all that and really make my characters feel more like real people.
Absolutely. No, I completely understand what you mean. Like I remember when I started writing myself, I distinctly remember specifically like all the characters that I would write or attempt in terms of the stories I would sketch were white. And that was like a massive realization. Even it was, I think this was up to college that I started to realize, like, why are all the characters that I'm writing are white? And it's like, and what of this society has made me in terms of my perception and my natural inclination to design or write characters that don't center my experience or the diversity of the world. It's like how do we even begin to like challenge our own self if if our identities and who we are and this sort of brokenness of the world, we've internalized this. Like, how does an emerging writer even, because I feel like there's so much in terms of the cultural wars that's happening right now, and I think it's for a necessary and important process in terms of like reflecting on history and amending the wrongs of the past. But like, how does a young writer, navigate like their own personal experiences and start to have like sort of an awareness of like, this is what I believe, this is my identity, but part of those things could also be that internalization that you mentioned.
Well, yeah, it's brainwashing, and the big trick is realizing you've been brainwashed. Mm. And I think you can get that from books. And I think the fact that we're seeing so many more writers of color, and so many that are being successful, and books are popular, winning the Hugo Awards, all that kind of stuff. I think it's because of the work that that first generation of writers of color did, like Octavia Butler. It gets mentioned a lot because she was an awakening for a lot of people. It's like, why can't I write characters like that? Kind of thing. Yeah. So I think that it multiplies, each writer that becomes published and popular and or even just out there where the people can find it, that encourages that snaps people out of that. It's I want to use the term, it's like decolonizing your brain.
Yeah,
I think it's kind of like that process, but it's where you realize it's like these stories were brainwashing you to a certain extent. When you encounter one that gives you reality, that opens your mind, and it's a process. And the more books you read and stories you read that open your mind, the more you can engage with these issues and free yourself from them.
Totally. I feel like this sort of, as you coined it, decolonizing the mind or decolonizing our imagination. I always kind of tied this to like Afrofuturism, and I'm more like, I always sort of feel like internally, the more stories that I consume, it's almost as if it's cracking open inside of me, so it makes more space in me for me to feel more and to have more empathy, more nuance, and more in a way.
Yeah, the more different people, different voices you read, writing about different characters and that reflect parts of their experience that's alien to you, the better off you are, because it just increases it increases your ability to understand how wide and varied the world is, and that's a great thing.
Absolutely. No, that's incredible. And I think this is a good shift perspective. I would love to like even explore, because everything you're saying is like resonates with me a lot. Like, I love to explore like your creative process and when you set out to start writing and designing like characters or designing worlds. Like, do you like, does a character kind of come at you and like scream and say, I want to be written? Or like, how do you make that variation, like you just said, in terms of like the need to write characters that are very different than you, so you can kind of push your creative powers? Because sometimes I feel like as an emerging writer right now in my life, I kind of lean a lot on like my natural kind of inclination, or like very action-based, like sort of revolutionary sort of type characters. But I guess, what is your creative process with writing characters, and how do you set the time or space to like explore it within the timeline?
I generally a lot of people tend to start with one or one aspect of something, like they build the world first, or they come up with the character first, or whatever. They come up with the plot first. To me, I kind of start with the character and the world kind of come together, because the world has to be a place that would have created that person I want to write about. And so it all kind of comes in, and it'll be vague stuff like, I got this idea about a place with very shallow oceans, and that would be kind of cool traveling in that place. And so what kind of person would live there, and what kind of, and then it has to come, and you have to kind of have a scenario you want to write about, and something that draws you personally into the story. I don't plot out a lot in advance, because I'm one of those people where if I figure out too much, it kind of, the story kind of goes dead for me. I like to kind of come up with it and try to experience it the way the reader would. I find this also makes mysteries easier to do, because if you don't know what the solution to the mystery is at the beginning, then you're not going to be able to accidentally, convey it. But so it all kind of comes together. And I think when I first started out, I tended to base books very heavily on real places or historical time periods, because that was easier. And doing that research, it was like a crutch. But I've done so much of that research now, it makes it easier to kind of try to come up with more unique places. And specific, like the books of the Raksura, I was really deliberately trying to make everything kind of weird and strange as I could. And so when I would come up with a place, I would think about, okay, I have this idea, well, this scene needs to take place here. How can I make this place even stranger? It's okay. Well, the city's going to rotate, and that's the way it generates power, and and all coming up with all as many weird ideas as I could. Oh, we're going through the forest. Well, one of the trees is going to be a person, basically. How will they relate to? How is this going to affect them as they go past, and that kind of thing? And trying to, that was the last fantasy I wrote, and then for Witch King. I was kind of the idea I had was, what if, thinking about what our world would look like without colonization, and if the ancient world had, those civilizations had all stayed as they were, basically, and all kind of grown up, and what that would look like. And then, what would it be like to be a fairly peaceful civilization interacting with other peaceful civilizations, and this thing comes out of nowhere, and and trying kind of taking those ideas and then looking at as I develop the world. And actually the characters tend to come first, so you have a character in a weird situation, and you just kind of go with that, and then kind of piece together the history and of everything that's going. I hope that makes sense. It's just kind of It's kind of it's really hard to describe, because it's a mass of things that start coming all together. It's like you come up with one little nugget, and other things come and clump on it until you have a giant organism.
No, 100%. It's like I totally understand. It's like sort of like you're spread out in every direction, and then for some reason there's like a beautiful melody that's supporting a resonance that's kind of, it sort of grows in a way.
Yeah, and it's just a lot of experience at creating stories and in different ways, I think, and just 27, 30 years of doing it.
What is, I guess, what does it look like on a day-to-day basis? Like when you're writing, do you like shut off your phone? Like when you get into you get into researching mode, like where do you go? Do you stay in this corner of the house? Or like, what do you eat? Do you eat snacks? Do you, like you said you had 2 cats, like what is sort of your sort of creative process? How many hours a day? Or what about when you don't feel like writing? And how like have you felt like you've gotten, because I know when you start as an emerging author, you have like certain expectations around what writing should be or what writing should look like, and you're trying to figure out what works for you. And then later on, it's like you've sort of coming to terms with that, like space is like, this is how I do things. So I guess, if you can give us an insight on your sort of the creative production of your time and your space and the cell phone and distractions.
Well, now I've noticed this past several years, the morning is a better time for me to write. So I have a sort of designate at our old house. I used to write in the master bedroom, because that was just the best place to do it. Now I actually have an office I can write in, now that we moved, and I'll go in there and I'll try to get started. I'm kind of a scattershot. Well, I've got a lot of anxiety issues, so I'll kind of like jump around a lot anyway. The ADHD kind of, they didn't diagnose that for women back in the 70s, so it's completely untreated. So when I'm writing, I'll write a little bit. I don't tend to do that big concentrated thing where you're just going hours with no distractions, because distractions kind of tend to help me. So I'll check my email. I'll go hop on and, look at, see if my friends are talking, on one of the social media. I'll get up and do, stuff around the house as I'm going. But it's usually 4 to 5 hours of productive time is about, I used to before COVID, I would write about 1,000 words on a good working day. And then if I did much more than that, I wouldn't be able to get much done the next day. It's like there's a finite amount of effort there, and I would use it up. Yeah. After COVID, I'm lucky. I had a big 6 months of writer's block during the first year of the pandemic, and I think a lot of people had similar problems at that point. Some people I know couldn't even have the concentration to read anymore for a while, but I get about 500 to 700 words now. And so I feel, and that's with, there was a writing advice. There's a lot of bad writing advice out there, but this was good advice where it said, if you can't do very much, lower your goal. So you're not beating yourself up, for not hitting a goal. Is lower it to something you can hit. And then everything above that is just like, oh, I'm doing so good. So that's what I've done. And yeah, I just, I'm having a lot of trouble lately trying to concentrate because we've just been having a busy year and it's been stressful with travel and stuff like that. So I'm trying to get more back into the habit. And that's also worse because I'm starting a new book. And it's also always so much worse trying to get started. It's a sequel. So, and that's much harder, I think, than writing the first book. So I'm trying to get in there and get back into the habit, just coming in here and sitting down and just going at it.
No, it's really incredible. And I'm so inspired. And the next question is almost as if it's on more on the bigger scales of what does it mean for you to be a sci-fi and fantasy writer, like in our times right now? Because for me, a lot of my values is that there's a lot of systemic, cultural, or even climactic problems that our society is facing. You can look at in every angle of our society, whether it's technology or politics or the war. There's a lot like that. You will not find enough of sort of deep changes and transformation that are needed to make our planet better. As someone that has a following, that has a platform, that has created a body of work, what is your why, and what do you think science fiction and fantasy, as a science fiction and fantasy writer, what do you think that means for you to write in this time today?
I think I've tried to kind of do two things. And one of them is, especially when in times like these, you do need escapism, and you need that place that you can go and have that safe space of insulation for your brain. It's kind of like with the Murderbot stories, where Murderbot watches the media and the TV shows as a way to deal with the trauma of its existence. And I think people need that. But I also think it does give you an opportunity to try to make people really think about these issues. And I really think, reading a book can rewire your brain. So you have to, that's kind of a big, you have to make sure you're writing what you believe, and you're really not necessarily putting a message, but that you are maybe giving people a space in it to confront these issues and to think about them. one of the big things in Murderbot is basically the corporate control and what the natural outcome of allowing that control, corporations to control people and corporations to be more important than people, and a corporation's life is more important than the people that it's destroying, that kind of thing. So trying to get people to think about that and about labor practices, and the most annoying thing to me is there was a review of one of the short stories I did for Wired magazine. There was a whole thing about the future of work that they did, and all these different authors had different short stories. And someone said, well, have any of these people ever heard of unions? Haha. And it was like, that was the point. This is what the future looks like if you don't have, if you don't give value to individual lives, and you don't protect, people's rights as workers. But yeah.
No, yeah, it's interesting how I don't know, I don't want to claim a space of righteousness, but it is interesting why certain times or certain people like think like harming others is like a normal thing, and it's like they see that certain actions or certain words or ways of being or harming other people and causing like systemic or rippling out in just a broader systemic problem. It baffles me. It seems like storytelling is like the most direct, but also the most sort of, like you said, kind of giving people a space to wrestle with these ideas, because these ideas, like you insinuated earlier, it's like stories sort of allow you to see more and to feel more, to engage more. That's amazing. I have a question, and it's from Marcia Clark. She's one of our showrunners and one of the co-creators of Parallelia, a world set in the future. And the question she asks says, what is a favorite character? Do you have a favorite character out of all the books you've written? Is there a favorite, and why? Why is that your favorite character?
It changes a lot as I go along, because sometimes it's the one I'm working on now. Sometimes I don't. I'm so working on the character I'm working on now is so difficult that I still like the last one I did. So probably Murderbot is going to be one of my favorite characters, because there's a lot of my own issues in Murderbot, and it's really one of the easiest characters to write, which sometimes makes the story difficult, because I can write anything in that voice. I can write, going trip to the grocery store or whatever in that voice. But just because I can write it doesn't mean that's good for the story, or it's taking it off in the wrong direction or something. But yeah, Murderbot is probably my favorite character.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about that. The idea that the character is gonna take a life of its own and take the story in a different direction. Like, how do you? Because as someone that is an explorer, I think they call it like the pincers or the and stuff.
The Gardner typewriter.
Oh, you're in a typewriter.
No, it's like a Gardner writer, where you're coming up with all different stuff and planning it to see what it does, basically.
Yeah. So how do you manage that tension between like wanting to discover the story and feel excited about it, but also keeping the integrity of like what the character is and potentially the intention of like the plot line, if you have a plot line yet? I don't know if it does, but
with me, there's a lot of, especially with Murderbot, there's a lot of rewriting, and I notice I'm doing that more and more. Sometimes with those novellas are usually only about 35,000 words long, and with some of them I've written about 20,000 words and then had to go take most of it out, just because the story was kind of wandering around looking for itself. And usually I'm better when I'm writing in the third person, I'm better at kind of going, this isn't working. This isn't working. Stop and kind of figure out where I've gone wrong. And with Murderbot in the first person, it can just wander off and all kinds of like dead ends before you kind of realize, yeah, this is not this is not what I want to happen for the story.
Wow, that's amazing. I totally see what you mean. We actually have another question. It's from Elise Hauser, and she's one of the newest members of the One Humanity Writing Collective. And I was telling you about that there is a cohort, international cohort of women and non-binary writers who are addressing the climate crisis through sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
And she says, can you speak about your experiences navigating the publishing world, especially through the major shifts between the last century and this one? Do you feel there are any new challenges or benefits of publishing in a digital age?
The big thing I've noticed is how you get information so much more quickly on how the book is doing. When I started out, you literally didn't know. Your friends threw a party for you, or you did a signing at a bookstore, and then you had really no idea until the royalty statement came. And now I think you have a lot more tools to see how your work is actually doing, separate from the publisher. I also think there's so much more information for writers out there now. When I started out, you had to, as I was lucky, and there was a science fiction fantasy convention at my university that I worked on as a student. So being able to go to seminars on panels, and science fiction fantasy is kind of fairly unique. Genre is fairly unique in that the fans and aspiring writers can speak to professional writers fairly easily at these events. So that's how you got information. Now you can just go online, and there's so many blogs and communities and everything out there that will give you information and warn you about scams and all that kind of stuff. I think one of the good things that has happened is, Nora Jemisin talks about when she was trying to sell her first novel, they were telling her, well, who is going to read this? Because it was, most of the characters were people of color. It was a different a world building. And now that seems crazy because, those books are not just her books, but most of a lot of the successful science fiction is along those lines, because I really think people had hit a point where you were getting, it was the same old, people were getting bored with it. And it's happened on TV, it's happened in the movies. As something comes out and is successful, and TV can kind of react to those things faster than the movies can. But you're starting to see more diversity and more voices, and it's just so much more interesting and so much better than this kind of squished down, there's very narrow categories and everything has to be the same. So I think there's benefits, and also I think part of the challenges are, again, the corporatization, the publishers building up into these, where you used to have a bunch and now you have 4 major publishers. I think that we still have a lot of independents publishers holding on. Well, not a lot, but some. And I think it's just the devaluation of writing and writers and artists and performers and everyone that has been happening steadily. I could get into the whole thing of, since the pre-code Hollywood, the attempt by corporate studios to make writers seem less important, as opposed to the people who could produce the story, or could write the story, the ones who should control everything. And you have to take that control away from them and diminish their importance. So I think that's all kind of a continuity we're seeing now. The idea of it's content. It's not a book that it took you a year to write. It's just content. And it's like and the idea somehow that the content is divorced from the person, and, that kind of stuff. There's challenges, and there's also, I think things are closing down in a lot of financial ways and becoming more difficult, but in other ways, it's opening up to this really grand vista of the future of science fiction and fantasy, where it's, all these diverse voices and international voices, and we have access to all these different stories from all over the world. One of the things that happened was during the pandemic was WorldCon, was the virtual conventions, and which meant that people from all over the world could come in and talk in these and be panelists and give readings and everything. And I'm so glad they're keeping so far with WorldCon. I don't know what Chengdu is going to do with having the virtual WorldCon, because again, that means it's really a WorldCon, because you can get people all over the world to do in the virtual component. So yeah, it's a really complex time, and there's a lot of good things about it and a lot of bad things about it.
Wow, that's a fantastic answer, and thank you, Elise, for that question, and Marsha for your question. I'm looking at the time. We have about, I think, 4 or 5 minutes left, and I wanted to squeeze in a question before giving you the space to talk about your 2 upcoming books. The last question was sort of related to this, is around like media tie-ins. And like, can you speak on your experiences with your media tie-ins, like with Star Wars or Stargate SG-1? What was that for you? Was it exciting, or was it like did take those stories in a very radically different way that you thought? Like, what like, because a lot of what we do in Syllable is, you hit it right in the nail. It's like we want to tap into those global audiences and global spaces of writers, to these collectors in these worlds. And we are based in LA, but in a very globally minded sense, is like we want to engage those media tie-ins as well, because I think that allows your ideas to have a further reach. So like, what is your experience with the media tie-ins?
It varies wildly from based on who the basically copyright holder is. Stargate SG-1, MGM didn't, and Stargate Atlantis, MGM didn't care very much about those books. So it was like whatever, that you wanted to do, they were pretty cool with it. And the person who was overseeing them was really very easy to work with, and didn't actually ask for, they were more thinking about helping you with the technology and pointing out, ideas for you and stuff like that. So that was a really good experience, actually. Magic the Gathering was a lot of fun, because it's a continuous story for however many years, and you're writing a segment of it, and then someone else is going to take up that segment after you. So that was neat. And so you got parts of the stories had to be very carefully outlined, because they were drawing on things that happened before, and there was a plot line that was being carried through, and you had to like make sure these elements were present, so that to basically hand it off to the next person. And then there were other sections of it where it's like, okay, we're introducing these new characters. You get to come up with their personalities and how they met and what they did and how they interact with your characters. And then someone is going to carry that on. So that was really cool. Star Wars was, I was a huge Star Wars fan from when I was, it came out when I was 13. And so this has really grabbed my brain. But it's so, at least at that point, when Lucasfilm still owned it, it felt very almost claustrophobic, and it just wasn't a lot of fun. Don't go too much into it, because I know other people like Daniel Jose Older has done one, and I really liked his Star Wars novel, and I've read some of the other people that have since Disney threw out all the continuity, including my book. They threw out my book. And they've had good experiences, it seems like. So I think it kind of radically changed there. But yeah, it is, you'll talk to people who had just like a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun doing it. And you'll talk to people who were it was just miserable, because it really does depend on the attitude of the company that owns it. And it's kind of it's part of my thing when I'm doing it is I'm really trying to So I don't write things unless I'm kind of a fan of them. So I'm really trying to make it good for the fans and make it fit into the world. And if it's something like Stargate Atlantis, try to capture those actors' performances, which is the really fun thing about watching it. And try to, and really make it fun for the fans, and then and a good story, and try to make it feel like part of that world. And that's kind of a different tightrope walk than creating an original story where you're creating everything and you're trying to make it feel like a vast universe that's actually out there. And so you're having to like make up all that stuff yourself, and you can't, you have to focus on everything. So it's two really kind of different types of writing. But I don't think one's harder than the other. They just both have different challenges.
No, that's really amazing, and thank you for sharing that. I'm looking at the time, and I wanted to thank you so much for being a guest in this author conversation to celebrate your life, hear about your journey. Like, I'd love to hear like the 2 books that will be published this year. If you can give like the date that it will be published, and I'll also post that information as well on the show notes on the Syllable site. But what are the 2 books, and also where can the viewers find you online if they want to reach out?
Coming out May 30th is Witch King. It's a fantasy novel. It's set in it's a secondary created world, all new, not part of anything I've done before. And then in November 14th, I think, is the next Murderbot novel. It's a short novel called System Collapse, and it takes place directly after Network Effect. And I left Twitter during the great Twitter collapse and migration. I have a website called marthawells.com, and that's got a link to my blog on Dreamwith. I think it's marthawells.dreamwith.org, but that may be wrong. But that's my blog, and also I'm on Goodreads. And I don't post and interact a lot, but I just put the books I'm reading and stuff like that. I'm still kind of, my online thing is still kind of in flux because of the Twitter's great,
Yeah. The great migration.
The great migration.
Yeah. Wow, Martha, this has been such a delight and pleasure to have you. I feel like I learned so much about craft and storytelling and writing, and kind of hearing your vision of what it means to be a writer. Thank you so much. And I am going to stop